Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to our first episode of Liberalism, understanding what it is and knowing how it works. Now, the question we have to kind of start off by asking is, why should we even study liberalism in the first place? I think what we have to think about is that liberalism is a dominant ethic in the Western world at the moment, and especially for Muslims living in the West, but not including Muslims living in different parts of the world. Liberalism will play a central role in shaping people's lives, making people think about certain things, and so on. So for Muslims and non-Muslims, it's an important thing to think about and to understand how it works. So today's objectives will be as follows, as you can see. Number one is to understand the first principles of liberalism. Number two is to know the history of liberal philosophy with special reference to three key thinkers. And number three, to be able to make a judgment on liberal assumptions. And I want to start off by saying, when we're studying something like political philosophy, it's important to realize that criticality is probably one of the most important ingredients in a healthy understanding of any subject, including, obviously, political philosophy and liberalism. Einstein once said that a student is not a container to be filled, but a torch to be illuminated. And so what we should be doing here as we're going through the steps and going through the motions is thinking, asking key questions, writing notes, being proactive learners, and so on. It's not good enough to passively be a recipient to this knowledge. You really do have to make active steps to research points that maybe I mention, ask questions, go online, do research, follow the trail of academic research, and so on. That is active learning. So moving on, there are two things that we should acquaint ourselves with when studying philosophy of any kind. Number one is epistemology, and number two is ontology. Now, the word ontology, it takes different forms and it means different things when we're talking about different philosophical precepts. But for the sake of brevity and simplicity, epistemology is how do we know it is? How can we prove it? Is a maybe a subsidiary question that we can ask, which relates to epistemology. Put another way, epistemology is making sense of the world. Epistemology is how do we make sense of the world, and how do we use that making sense of the world to make sense of the world. Ontology is what are we in relation to it? What are we in relation to that epistemology? So you could say it's quite difficult to have an ontology without an epistemology. In any rate, these words are going to be coming in, so make sure that if you do have some kind of notes that you're taking, that you have a glossary section, and put those two words in the glossary. These are basic definitions, but obviously you can go online and find other definitions. I would recommend, by the way, that when you're looking at definitions, don't just be content with dictionary definitions. Try and find the terminological definition. So try and find maybe a political scientist or a political philosopher who has a definition which is somewhat agreed upon on these two things, or anything in that, as a matter of fact. Now, arguments from first principles. Generally speaking, in philosophy, you can argue in different ways. You can make your point and prove your point in different ways. You can make arguments from analogy, for example. That's a way in which someone can make an argument. And that is an effective way that people make arguments all the time. And you can also argue from first principles. Now, what are first principles? First principles are the basic building blocks, if you like, of any philosophical system. So if you strip something down to its basic component parts, first principles will be bare. So in other words, if you take a bike, for example, a bicycle, and you break it up into its constituent parts, you're going to have maybe a chain, you're going to have metal, break the chain down, you're going to have, and so on and so forth. So it's breaking something down to the lowest common denominator. These are the first principles of the thing. And so first principles are used in interdisciplinary studies, in physics, in philosophy, in mathematics, and so on. Because you always need to start with first principles. So there's proofs in mathematics from first principles, there are proofs in philosophy from first principles, and there are proofs in physics from first principles. So why are first principles important? The reason why first principles are important is because if the foundation of a proposed idea, for example, are not, let's say, intact, then it's difficult to make arguments from those first principles. In other words, a philosophy is only as strong as the principles which underpin it. You can't have castles in floating air. We need to be able to be exposed to the foundations of every building. And in the philosophical jargon, this would be the first principle. So how are first principles related to assumptions and presuppositions? Now, assumptions and presuppositions are those things on which ideas depend. Sometimes they are known and sometimes they are not known. Sometimes they're explicit and sometimes they're implicit. And so first principles relate to those things because they explain to us on what basis things are based. And what are the first principles of liberalism? Obviously, we're going to come to that in what follows. So how do we know what liberalism is in the first place? So liberalism in and of itself is a political philosophy. It emerged out of, you could say, a historical and political situation. And you could actually geographically pin it down to Western Europe and then by extension the Americas. So a lot of historians and philosophers would say that the founding father, if you like, of liberalism was John Locke. Some say no, it was Thomas Hobbes. Now, Thomas Hobbes wrote a book called The Leviathan, and this book was about the Leviathan is really a creature which is depicted in the Old Testament. But the idea is the Leviathan is a big body, and in the analogy, Thomas Hobbes talks about social contract. The social contract theory was such a big part of liberalism, which we're going to come to, right? Social contract theory is such a big part of liberalism that those who suppose that Thomas Hobbes was the founding father do so on the basis of him laying down formally what is referred to as coming out of the state of nature and coming into a social contract. So Thomas Hobbes and John Locke is contested. Maybe either or both of them are the founding fathers of liberalism. But if we take that thesis on board, we're talking about maybe the 17th century or 16th, 17th century, which is a good 500-600 years ago where liberalism started. Now, notable contributors to liberalism include John Stuart Mill, who was, of course, a Victorian philosopher who existed in Victorian England and who wrote many books like On Liberty and Utilitarianism, and who is a notable contributor to liberalism, especially social liberalism, because of his harm principle, which we're going to come and talk about. John Rawls is dubbed actually as one of the most notable philosophers in the 20th century. He is probably the last really most important philosopher that people study in university in terms of the timeline, and contributed to liberalism. People do PhDs on John Rawls, on his theories of justice. And other people that came in before John Mill, like John Rousseau and so on, are also notable contributors. What is consistent in terms of epistemology in all of the works of these men? Now, this is a very important question, because now we're saying what unifies the scholarly tradition from, say, Thomas Hobbes or John Locke up until John Rawls, for example, and after John Rawls. What unifies the scholarly tradition? What are the principles? What are the founding first principles, if you like, that unifies all of those things? And what kind of evolution of thought existed at this time? So we're going to talk about that. Epistemological basis. Now, if you look at the two treatises of government, which is a book that John Locke wrote, and a very important book in the history of liberalism, if not one of the most important books in the whole history of liberalism, he actually tells us exactly what, John Locke tells us exactly what the principles of liberalism are. So he says, for example, that you have the hedonistic principle. The hedonistic principle is you have two lords, as Jeremy Bentham, which we're going to talk about, came to describe them as. Two lords, two ultimate lords, the Lord of pain and the Lord of pleasure. And through those lords, we can navigate moral realities, if you like, or moral truths even. So morals are based on the hedonistic principle. What feels good is good. So it's quite subjective from that perspective. And as it's mentioned there, it's extended into utilitarianism, which we're going to talk about. So that's one of the principles, the hedonistic principle. Number 2 is theology. So there is an extensive mentioning in the 2 treatises of government and other books that he wrote of theology. So John Locke makes candid and specific reference to the Old and New Testaments, but he also makes generic statements about God, about how we're born equal, and how we're created in this way or created in that way. So a lot of the underpinnings of liberalism are actually theological underpinnings. And you can see this all the way up to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and before that the US documents, like for example the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence after 1776 when America became independent. So all of these kinds of references to God are made, or creation. These references are made because liberalism is affected by theological discourse. And it could be argued that in fact it's so affected by theological discourse, it acts as one of its first principles. So theology, or the creation story, the idea in God creating man, is one of the first principles according to John Locke. One has to pause and ask themselves a question at this stage and say, what about an atheist liberal? Because it is conceivable that you can be an atheist liberal, but then they have to go back to first principles, an atheist liberal, and ask themselves, how is it the case now that we can justify statements like all men are born free, or that all men are born equal? Because according to John Locke, those justifications were based on theological principles. So, number 3, John Rawls had an interesting idea, which we're going to visit. It's called the veil of ignorance. And so he was really after equity, if you like. He wanted to make sure that people would be in the best, most fair positions. So he proposed something in his theory of justice called the veil of ignorance. In this short session, we don't have exactly the time to go into details about it, but it's an important point of research. Now, if you're taking notes, write down the veil of ignorance, maybe watch a YouTube video about it, or read something about it, because it's an important concept in liberalism, and it's a contribution, it's an original contribution to liberal thought. But once again, it does still fall within the remit, and he did criticize, by the way, utilitarianism to some extent, and he did revisit, if you like, the first principles of liberalism to some extent. Yet, he was definitely confined within the liberal tradition. So, hedonism or hedonism and individualism are closely connected. Now, individualism is the idea that the human being is abstracted, and the main concern of the human being should be that individual's own concern. It's quite a selfish understanding of life, of how human interactions, but this is liberalism to a great extent. Hedonism and individualism are connected. Now, you've got to understand that new liberalism post-World War II, and especially we're going to visit this in the third session that we do, new liberalism after kind of post-World War II, you could say that rights started to supersede responsibilities. And this is a big discussion, which we're going to revisit as well, about individualism versus communitarianism, right? And there's many books that are written, refutations and counter-refutations about What should supersede what? Should rights come first or should responsibilities come first? Now, if you look, for example, at the UN Declaration of Human Rights, as once again I mentioned that we're going to be looking at soon, all of the kind of articles, the 30 articles, propose rights. The right to this and the right to that and the right to this and the right to that. And a question that many people ask is, to what extent is that an effective way of ensuring, for example, of creating a just society? So counter theses range, for example, from the fact that there should be more of a communitarian, community emphasis, that we're not independent, that we're interdependent, and so on. But once again, we will cover that soon. But the idea of individualism is that the individual is prioritized over the other units of sociological categorization, which means, for example, that the individual unit is more important as a unit of analysis than the family unit or the community unit. And the question one has to ask here is, what is the basis for that? And one could argue the basis is the hedonistic principle, is itself the hedonistic principle, or as we'll see, utilitarianism itself. So it's important now to have a timeline. If you're writing notes, once again, I do recommend that if you're going through this series, that you actually write notes, because otherwise it's going to be quite a fruitless endeavor, and it might be quite tedious in many ways, or otherwise you won't be able to retain much of the information that you're now getting. Obviously, if you guys were in front of me, I'd be asking you questions and trying to stimulate some kind of interaction. However, since you guys are not there, we both have to try our best. You guys have to try from your end, and I have to try from my end, to ensure that you are as active as possible, because this is the best way in which knowledge acquisition is done. Active learning rather than passive learning. So these are some key dates which are very important. I would have a timeline on my page at this point, and I'd literally draw a timeline, and I might give you a chance to pause this video and write down all those things. So here we've got the English Civil War from 1641 to 1651, the Bill of Rights in 1689, and John Locke died 1706. Now let's look at those three first points. Obviously, this stuff is happening in England, and so England and Britain are very important, or the histories of England and Britain are very important in order to understand liberalism. Much of liberalism emanated from that country, or from this country, as we should be saying. Right, so John Locke died in 1706. He contributed to the information that would be written in the Bill of Rights in 1689. So in other words, John Locke's ideas were so forceful and so influential that his ideas would be incorporated into the Bill of Rights, which is one of the most important documents in all of British history. Maybe in the top 10 there with the Magna Carta and parts of the Constitution, although we don't have in Britain a codified constitution. We do have an uncodified one made up of different things. So John Locke's contribution to the Bill of Rights is something that can't be disregarded. And his subsequent contribution, even after his death, on the United States founding fathers is also something which is recognized by many scholars. And so the documents that we mentioned before, things like the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, 1776, those documents have many of the, the writings, if you like, of John Locke rehashed into them. So he had a profound impact, not only on the legislative and the constitutional formatting of the United Kingdom's system, but also the United States of America itself, which was, by the way, one of the only countries in history to actually formally have a liberal basis. It wasn't a monarchy like Britain. It was strictly a republic, which depended upon those liberal principles that John Locke offered us some 70 years before. Rousseau, he died 1778, and he's a really important contributor to the discourse. So Rousseau is worth looking at, especially in conjunction with social contract theory, but also in conjunction with other things that we're going to be talking about. France, obviously, in France, there was a revolution, just like in America. It actually happened some 15 years later, or 15 to 20 years after America. And so their government documents, and we're talking about how the country is actually founded, their documents are actually founded, again, on liberal principles. And even when Napoleon became leader of France, and he was a dictator, he still relied upon liberal principles, and therefore he was referred to by many people as the liberal dictator. Immanuel Kant is one of the most important philosophers of all time in the Western world, and he was, in fact, you could certainly argue, he was a liberal himself. He did have his own philosophical system of categorical imperatives, but he did contribute to liberalism, especially in the field of what you call cosmopolitanism, which is the idea of universal law, which would then have an impact on organs and institutions like the United Nations, for example, which obviously incorporated this idea of a universal law. And then we're going to visit that as well, because there's issues of enforcement. So if you have a universal law, who should be the enforcers of that law? And as we know, the United Nations is almost always going to be their hegemonic power. John Stuart Mill, we talked about him. He was in the Victorian period in England. So once again, a British English philosopher contributing to the discourse. And if my memory serves me correctly, the Victorian era started from 1837. So he was somewhere in the middle of the Victorian era. He died 1873. And his contributions were notable, especially because he actually wrote about a range of topics. He preceded many first-wave feminists in talking about universal suffrage for women, for example. And he, as we talked about before, he refined the harm principle. He built upon utilitarianism of Jeremy Bentham. And so his contribution is really probably one of the most important ones in all of liberalism, especially social liberalism. So having his name in your mind, if you want to know about liberalism, is certainly something that you should have. World War I and World War II, you cannot know liberalism without knowing the histories of World War I and World War II. And the reason why is because before World War I, you had very fixed and acceptable in the social atmosphere systems of empire. So you had systems of empire. You had empires, especially in Western Europe, where Western European powers, in about 1904, according to Homi Bhabha, they controlled about 85% of the world's population. So you imagine, this is the depth and the breadth of the empire invasion, and how empire was so important. And the question here, obviously, is how could liberalism and empire coexist? That would be a question. Yep, it is something that did happen. And obviously, the after World War I aftermath, the aftermath after World War I was something which shaped the way in which we understand liberalism altogether. Especially with the establishment of the League of Nations, especially with new treaties and peace treaties that would happen between different countries that were at first in competition with each other in terms of empire and so on. World War II, once again, one of the most catastrophic wars in all of human history in terms of human casualty. And we all know the story of the Nazis and the Holocaust and all those atrocious and monstrous things that happened in that time period. But having said that, what happened after World War II with kind of like, you could say, the collapse of empire and the emergence of what you call a bipolar system. A bipolar system in international relations is where you have two major superpowers. In the case of after World War II, the two major superpowers was, of course, Soviet Union and the United States of America. And so after World War II, what you had is the Cold War from 1945 up until about 1991 to 94, depending on how you do your calculations. But that time period was a very important time period because of the establishment of the UN and because of its impact and the establishment of international law, the establishment of UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and so many other developments which have become so much part of our modern parlance and modern vernacular that we speak of human rights and so on. We're going to come to that in the third session, where we talk about to what extent was this actually part of the parlance before that time period. That's an important consideration, and obviously an important one for the history of liberalism. And we leave that to the final point, is the Human Rights Declaration in 1948, which we'll spend some time actually studying by itself. Now, some questions here, which we've kind of already raised. Should society be prioritized over and above the individual? Now, the question of individualism is at the heart of the liberal discourse. So I want you to think about this question and think about the justification, the possible justifications. In fact, if you have the time now, put this question on your piece of paper and write down what you think someone who supports individualism would say in terms of society being prioritized over and above the individual. What kind of points do you think could be made? And what kind of counterpoints do you think could be made? So people like John Charvet, he's an individualist. He defends individualism quite strongly. Charles Taylor, he's a communitarian. Michael Sandel, he's also a communitarian. And by the way, Michael Sandel has a very, very interesting series online on Harvard YouTube channel of the theories of justice. He has an incredible, I think it's a 12-part series, an excellent one that I definitely recommend at this point in time. So put that in the, maybe you have a page of recommendations, you have a glossary now, you have a page of recommended readings and material, and you also have your main part where you're writing your stuff. And as I said to you before, guys, if you're not writing, you're not being active with this information, it's going to fly above your head and you're not going to benefit from it whatsoever. Or you might have some benefit. Right, so utilitarian criticism of liberalism. So we're going to come to this. Bentham critiqued liberalism. Remember, Jeremy Bentham was the friend of the father of John Stuart Mill, James Mill. So James Mill and Jeremy Bentham were good friends. And obviously John Stuart Mill was kind of raised in that environment. And John Stuart Mill himself was a utilitarian, and he refined utilitarianism, but Bentham did have his critique of liberalism, which we are going to mention in later episodes. Sociological criticisms of liberalism, which is another issue. Some sociological criticisms of liberalism have been made by communitarians, by Marxists, by utilitarians, by others. The neutrality problem, which is something that Michael Sandel talks about, where he kind of makes the point that if you don't have the kind of ability, if you have a religious kind of concern, to voice that and put that into the public sphere, then that isn't really an expression of the individual, he argues. So there's an issue here, there's a tension between secularism and liberalism, which is interesting and important. To conclude, liberalism is a product, should be here. Liberalism is a product of historical developments linked to peace and war. It's very difficult to understand liberalism, especially on a political or geopolitical level, without understanding peace and war. And particularly, as we said, the age of empire, and more particularly even World War I and World War II. Philosophers' major impact on constitutions and government documents. Here we mean, for example, John Locke's contribution to the Bill of Rights, and also to, for example, the documents of the United States of America. The axiomacity of liberal premises. Now, what we mean by this, an axiom, if you go and want to see a standard definition of the word axiom, is really something that is believed without evidence. An axiom, you should actually underline this word here and put it in your keywords, because it's something which is in mathematics. You have axioms and you have theorems, and it's also quite important in philosophy as well, especially for doing epistemology. The axiom, when we say the axiomacity of liberal premises, we're talking about the fact that a lot of these premises that we talked about from first principles, things like hedonism, or things like utilitarianism, or things like whatever it may be, are actually axiomatic, so they don't have any evidence in and of themselves. You can't prove them. And in fact, John Stuart Mill, in his book on utilitarianism, if I remember correctly, in chapter 4, he actually had a part called Proving Utilitarianism. Now, it's really interesting. If you actually do that as a reading for homework, guys, that will be well appreciated. I'm not telling you to read all of utilitarianism, but just linking on this epistemology question, if you want to do a primary source reading, which will give you a real flavor of what liberal theory is about, I would download on utilitarianism on PDF, or read it in book format, and look at chapter 4. So the truth claim, therefore, even according to Mill, as you'll come to see if you read the book or the chapter, is problematic. In terms of moral realism and objectivism, it's difficult to make an absolute truth claim on liberalism. And it's important to realize that when we move forward with liberalism. Because to what extent can you make a morally justifiable case of objective proportions is very difficult if you're a liberal. Utility functionality is different from the truth, because some people will say, well, it works, right? If something works, it doesn't mean it's true. Just because something works, it doesn't mean it's true. For example, Newtonian physics was working just fine. It didn't mean it was fully corrigible or incorrigible. It was disproven, debunked, falsified, and improved to a great extent. I'm not saying fully, by Einsteinian physics. We talked about this quite a lot of times. Maybe you should do some research on communitarianism. Probably the most notable book to be read here, and you can put this in your recommended readings here, is Michael Sandel's book. And also, in terms of online resources, his 12-part series on the Harvard YouTube channel is absolutely excellent. Probably one of the best series, and he's an excellent teacher as well. So you should watch that to understand how Western philosophy works. Basis of human rights. So human rights is an outgrowth of liberalism. So you can't understand human rights without understanding liberalism. When you hear about things like human rights is this and human rights is that, we go all the way back to first principles and say, well, to what extent can we substantiate this on a morally objective level? And here, this is a really interesting last thing to kind of end off with. Liberalism as religion. Because to what extent can liberalism be said to be an ideology and not a religion depends upon, of course, your definition of religion. For example, John Gray writes an interesting book called Black Mass. It's called Black Mass. And in it, he says that there's not really much different, his argument goes, between like political philosophies and ideologies on the one hand, and religions in the conventional traditional sense on the other hand. And so he makes the argument that liberalism is a religion in that sense. It's just that it's shrouded with kind of social, political jargon, which kind of distinguishes it as a social or political philosophy. But many people have this kind of understanding of religion, like even Emil Durkheim, who was seen as the founding father of sociology, had this kind of broad understanding of what religion actually means. And so do the political philosophies fall into them or not? And this is an important part of the discourse, because if we can establish that liberalism is a religion, and say, for example, Hinduism, Christianity, or Islam are religions also, then we can start dealing with them all in the same way. And we can reconceptualize what it means for a religious person to be a religious person. A religious person doesn't necessarily doesn't have to be, for example, praying or sacrificing in order to be quote-unquote religious. They can be, in fact, engulfed by an ideological system, according to these definitions, which have their presuppositions in axioms, and so therefore they have full belief in those systems, just like a religious believer would believe in, for example, the metaphysical supernatural. So that's an important consideration as well. And I would say that, guys, make sure that you go over your notes. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.